Have you ever been so desperate that your voice trembled, just asking for a chance? Not for pity, not for money, but simply for work, for dignity. Picture this on a cold, windswept morning in the wild plains of the American West. A woman with tired eyes and shaking hands knocks on the door of a lonely ranch. She's hungry, broke, and carrying the weight of a past she never deserved. She whispers, "Please, I'll do anything. I just need work." The man who opens the door, a weathered cowboy, silent and distant, looks at her for a long moment. Then he says words that stop her heart. "I don't need a servant. I need a wife." What would you do if it were you? Would you run afraid of another lie, another trap, or would you stay and take a leap of faith that might change your life forever? This is not just a story about hardship. It's about two broken souls, one running from the past, the other haunted by finding something neither expected. Hope. Can love really grow in the ashes of pain? Can a single act of kindness rebuild a life destroyed by fear? Maybe the answer lies in this story about redemption, courage, and the quiet miracle of being seen when you feel invisible. If you've ever been hurt, lost, or long to believe again, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes a single story can remind us that even in the loneliest places, love can still find a way. The wind carried dust across the open plains, whispering against the dry grass that stretched for miles. The late afternoon sun burned low, painting the horizon in a tired gold. Along the narrow dirt road, a woman walked slowly, her steps uneven, her breath shallow. A little girl followed close behind, clutching her mother's torn shawl. The woman's name was Grace Miller. Her boots were worn through at the heels, the leather cracked from too many miles. The small suitcase she carried looked heavier than she did. Her daughter, Lily, tried to hum softly, maybe to keep herself brave, maybe to keep her mother from falling apart. Grace hadn't eaten since dawn. The last loaf of bread was gone 2 days ago. The water in her flask was warm and nearly empty. Every step on that endless road felt like another test of her will. She whispered a quiet prayer that somewhere ahead, someone would still have mercy left to offer. In the distance, a shape began to rise from the haze. A house, a barn, a windmill that creaked slowly in the heat. The words on the gate were barely visible, carved into weathered wood, Silver Creek Ranch. Grace stopped, brushing the dust from her skirt. Her throat felt dry as sand, but she forced herself to stand tall. Lily tugged at her hand. "Mama, are we going to live here now?" Grace managed a weak smile. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. Let's just ask kindly." The gate screeched as she pushed it open. The yard was silent except for the distant sound of horses snorting from the corral. A man was working near the barn, his back turned to them. He was tall, shoulders broad, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, showing arms darkened by sun and labor. Grace hesitated, her heart pounding. She had knocked on so many doors in the past months. Some opened with pity, some slammed in fear. This time, she didn't know what to expect. She took a deep breath, stepped forward, and spoke. "Sir." Her voice cracked halfway through. She tried again, softer. "Sir, please, I'm looking for work. I can clean, cook, wash, tend to the animals. Anything you might need?" The man straightened slowly, turning toward her. His eyes were deep, steady, unreadable, the kind of eyes that had seen too much loss and learned not to show surprise anymore. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her, then at the little girl behind her, then back again. Grace swallowed hard. Her hands shook. She wished she could stop trembling, but exhaustion had stripped away every defense she once had. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like gravel under boots. "You came a long way." "Yes, sir," she answered. "From where, Helena?" she said, her voice breaking again. "My husband, he worked in the mines there. The accident took him last winter. I've been trying to find work ever since." The man nodded once, slowly. He didn't offer sympathy, but he didn't turn her away either. That, in itself, felt like kindness. "You and the child hungry?" he asked. Grace blinked. We could use a little water, sir. That would be more than enough." He pointed toward the porch. "There's a well behind the house. The pump still works." Grace bowed her head slightly. "Thank you. Truly." As she and Lily walked toward the house, Grace could feel the man's gaze on her back. Not judgmental, but curious, protective, maybe. It was hard to tell. She didn't look back. She was afraid that if she met his eyes again, she might break down and cry. The well stood beside the porch, its metal handle cool under her hand. She pumped twice, and clear water splashed into the bucket. Lily giggled softly as she cupped her small hands to drink. That sound, her child's laughter, was enough to keep Grace steady. For a moment, she forgot the miles, the hunger, the grief. There was still beauty left in the world, even if it came one drop at a time. When she looked up again, the man was standing at the porch, wiping his hands with a rag. "You can sit if you like," he said simply. Grace hesitated. "You're kind, sir." He shrugged. "Just decent. Ain't much of that left these days." He motioned to a wooden bench. She sat carefully, hands folded in her lap. Lily curled beside her, already half asleep from the long walk. The man leaned against the porch post, looking out at the fading light. "Name's Samuel Reed," he said after a while. "Grace Miller," she replied softly. He nodded again. "You got a place to go after this?" She shook her head. Nowhere else. The sound of the windmill turning filled the silence between them. Grace stared at her hands, calloused and rough, and wondered if there was still a place in the world where hands like hers could belong. Samuel Reed watched her in quiet thought. Something in her voice, the way it had trembled when she first spoke, had stirred something long buried inside him. When the sun dipped below the horizon, he finally spoke again. "You can stay for supper. We'll talk after." Grace opened her mouth to thank him, but no words came. Her throat closed. Her eyes burned. She nodded instead. For the first time in months, someone hadn't told her to move along. As they followed him into the dimly lit house, the smell of wood smoke and bread greeted them. Grace's chest tightened. She didn't know if this place would save her, or if it would just be another stop along a road that never ended. But for tonight, she and her daughter had warmth, food, and the sound of a man's steady voice guiding them inside. And for the first time, in a long time, hope didn't feel like a lie. The sun had long slipped behind the ridge when Grace and Lily followed Samuel into the house. The front door hung a little crooked, its paint faded to the color of old bone. When it closed behind them, the noise of the plains disappeared, replaced by the faint crackle of fire and the smell of stew simmering on the stove. Grace paused near the entryway, unsure if she should remove her hat or wait to be told. The air inside was warmer than she'd felt in months, thick with the scent of smoke, meat, and pine soap. It smelled like a home that had once known laughter. Samuel motioned toward the table. Sit. Grace sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Lily climbed up onto the bench beside her, eyes wide as she studied the room. Everything seemed old, but cared for shelves lined with books, tools hanging neatly above the hearth, a quilt folded on the back of a worn armchair. Samuel ladled stew into 3 bowls and set them down. He didn't say grace, just waited until they started eating before taking a seat himself. For a long while, the only sounds were spoons tapping against bowls. The stew was simple potatoes, onions, and a bit of rabbit, but to Grace it tasted like a miracle. She ate slowly, afraid it might vanish if she moved too fast. After a few minutes, Samuel broke the silence. "You got family anywhere close?" Grace shook her head. "No, sir. My parents passed years ago. My husband was all I had left." "What happened at the mines?" She looked down at her bowl. "A cave-in. They said it was quick. But I don't think there's any such thing." Samuel's jaw tightened. "No, there ain't." Grace studied him for a moment. He hadn't said much, but his tone carried weight like someone who knew the sound of loss too well. Lily finished eating and began to nod off beside her. Grace brushed a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Go on, sweetheart. You can lie down for a bit." Samuel pointed to a small room near the stairs. "She can use that for tonight. It's clean enough." Grace carried Lily inside. The little bed smelled of cedar and sun-dried sheets. Lily fell asleep before Grace even tucked the blanket. When Grace stepped back into the main room, Samuel was stoking the fire. "Thank you for the meal," she said. "I'll find a way to repay your kindness." He didn't look up. Kindness don't need repaying. But work's different. "I can work," she said quickly. "I can clean, cook, mend whatever you need done." Samuel leaned on the poker, eyes glinting in the firelight. "You always this ready to bargain for a place?" Grace hesitated. "When you've run out of choices. You learn not to wait for someone to offer." Something in her words made him look at her longer than before. He saw the exhaustion, but also something steadier beneath it, resolve, the kind that only pain could teach. "You sound like someone who's been fighting a long time," he said. Grace gave a faint smile. "Maybe, but fighting doesn't always mean winning." Samuel nodded toward the chair near the fire. "Sit a while. The nights get cold." She sat. The flames flickered against the walls, revealing small details she hadn't noticed before: a pair of boots by the door, a cracked photograph on the mantel, a child's wooden horse coated in dust. She looked away quickly, sensing those things belonged to ghosts she had no right to disturb. "You live alone here?" she asked. Samuel poked the fire again. For a while now. He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, but not unfriendly. It was the silence of 2 people who understood what it meant to lose too much. Outside, the wind had quieted. The old house creaked with the settling cold. Grace rubbed her hands near the fire and let her mind drift back to Helena, the noise of the town, the smell of coal dust, the sound of her husband's laugh before it was swallowed by the mines. She wondered if she'd ever laugh like that again. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Mr. Reed, I don't mean to trouble you more than I already have. If you'd let me stay till morning, I'll move on at first light." Samuel studied her, his brow furrowed. "Where would you go?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth was, she had no answer. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. "Ain't many places left to go if you're running from something that ain't behind you anymore." Grace frowned slightly. "And what do you mean by that?" He looked into the fire instead of at her. Sometimes it's not the past chasing us. It's the part of ourselves we don't want to meet again. She didn't know how to reply. His words lingered, strange and heavy. When the clock on the wall struck 9, Samuel stood. "You can take the room next to your girls. There's water in the basin if you need to wash up. I'll be up before dawn." Grace rose, unsure if she should thank him or apologize again. In the end, she simply said, "Good night, Mr. Reed." He gave a small nod, the kind that meant both farewell and understanding. "Night, ma'am." In the small room, Grace lit a single lamp. The walls were bare except for a cross carved into the headboard. She sat on the edge of the bed, untying her boots, and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back was older than she remembered, tired, lined, but still alive. She whispered to herself, "Just one night, then we'll keep going." But deep down, something told her that this place, this faded house on Silver Creek Ranch, wasn't just another stop. It felt like the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Downstairs, Samuel sat alone by the fire. He reached for the photograph on the mantel and ran a thumb over the image of a woman and a little boy. Their faces were smiling, frozen in a life that no longer existed. He set the picture down carefully and stared into the flames. Outside, the wind began again, low and restless, moving through the grass like a whisper of things left unsaid. And in 2 separate rooms, 2 lonely souls closed their eyes, each wondering if, by morning, the world might look a little less empty. Morning came slowly to Silver Creek Ranch. The sky was painted with long strokes of rose and pale gold, the kind of dawn that promised heat later in the day. The air smelled of dry grass and smoke from the dying embers in the hearth. Grace awoke to the faint sound of boots moving across the floorboards below. She sat up, the memory of yesterday returning like a dream half remembered. Lily was still asleep, her curls spread across the pillow, her breathing soft. For the first time in months, Grace had slept through the night without waking in fear. She washed quickly, using the cool water in the basin, then brushed the dust from her skirt. When she stepped into the hall, she heard a kettle whistling downstairs. The smell of coffee drifted upward, strong, bitter, real. Samuel stood by the stove, pouring himself a cup. He nodded when he saw her. "Morning." Grace hesitated near the table. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." He gestured toward a chair. "Coffee's hot. Bread's on the counter if you want." Grace murmured a thank you and poured herself a small cup. The first sip burned her tongue, but the warmth spread through her chest like courage. She hadn't tasted coffee since the winter her husband died. It almost felt like a luxury too great to accept. After a while, Samuel asked, "Your girl still sleeping?" "Yes," Grace said softly. "She needs the rest. She's walked more miles than any child should." Samuel nodded. "She's a tough one. Reminds me of a colt that won't give up even when the road turns to stone." Grace smiled faintly. "She's stronger than I am. Some days." He didn't disagree. They ate in quiet, outside. The windmill creaked, and a horse snorted in the corral. The ranch felt both vast and lonely, a place carved out of stubbornness and silence. Grace glanced around the room again, taking in the neatness, the order. Everything had a place, yet everything looked as though it had been untouched for a long time. "You keep it tidy here," she said. Samuel shrugged. "Easier that way. Less to think about." "You live alone and still keep 2 extra rooms?" she asked gently. He gave a small smile without warmth. "Old habits." The house was built for more people once. Grace felt the heaviness behind his words. She didn't ask about the photograph she'd seen last night, though it lingered in her mind. Some griefs didn't need names. By mid-morning, Lily came downstairs, rubbing her eyes. Samuel handed her a piece of bread with honey spread across it. She smiled shyly before taking it. "You like horses?" he asked her. Lily nodded, her mouth full. "Well," he said, "if your mama doesn't mind, you can come help feed 'em later." Grace looked at him in surprise, but he only lifted his coffee cup as if it were nothing. For the first time, Lily laughed, a small, bright sound that filled the kitchen like sunlight. The hours that followed passed with quiet purpose. Grace washed dishes, swept the floors, and hung linens outside to dry. The rhythm of simple work steadied her nerves. Every task was a small proof that she could still be useful, still build something that looked like life. Samuel spent the morning repairing a fence near the corral. Grace watched him from the porch for a while. He moved with slow precision, every strike of the hammer deliberate. He wasn't a man of haste, but one of endurance. When the midday sun grew harsh, he came inside, wiping sweat from his neck with a handkerchief. "You shouldn't stay out too long," he said. "He'll wear you down faster than hunger." Grace nodded. "I was thinking the same." They shared lunch at the table, just bread, beans, and a few apples from a crate in the cellar. Lily chatted between bites about the horses she'd met, and Samuel listened with the patience of someone who'd forgotten what a child's voice sounded like. After the meal, Grace began washing up again. She noticed Samuel watching her from the doorway. "You don't have to do all that," he said. She kept scrubbing. "I want to. It feels good to work for what we've been given." He crossed his arms. "You make it sound like I'm paying wages." "I don't mean it that way," she replied. "But gratitude needs hands, not just words." Samuel considered that for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." As the day faded into evening, the three of them ate together once more. The firelight softened the edges of the room. Lily leaned against Grace's shoulder, already half asleep. Samuel poured more coffee for Grace and said quietly, "You plan on leaving tomorrow?" She hesitated, tracing a finger along the rim of her cup. "I thought I should. You've done more than most would." He looked toward the window, where the last traces of daylight slipped away. "You could stay another day. There's always work that needs doing." Grace met his eyes, unsure what he meant. "Work. You say?" He nodded. "Fences, feed, dishes. This place doesn't run itself." A small smile touched her lips. "Then I'll stay. For a little while." Samuel gave a quiet grunt of agreement, but inside something shifted. He didn't know why he'd asked her to stay. Maybe because the house sounded different, now less hollow, more human. When Grace carried Lily upstairs later, she paused on the landing and glanced back toward the kitchen. Samuel sat by the fire again, same as the night before, but his shoulders weren't quite as tense. The flames reflected in his eyes, and for a brief second, she saw a man not made of stone, but of flesh and memory, in her room. Grace brushed Lily's hair and tucked her in. The window was open a crack, letting in the faint scent of sage and dust. She sat at the edge of the bed, whispering a prayer of thanks not for safety, but for stillness. For the first time in so long, she felt the world wasn't chasing her. Downstairs. Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire until it blurred. He thought about the woman upstairs, the tremor in her voice, the way she carried herself like someone afraid to need help, but too brave to stop trying. He didn't know what to call the feeling stirring in his chest, only that it had been absent for far too many years. That night, the ranch slept in rare peace. The wind was calm, the horses quiet, the stars scattered thick above the roof. Inside that faded house, 3 souls rested beneath the same roof, none of them knowing how much their fates had already begun to tangle together. The following morning rose clear and quiet, a soft mist drifting over the fields like a thin veil of smoke. The air was cool enough to make Grace draw her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch. Samuel was already outside, feeding the horses. His movements were steady, practiced. She watched for a moment before walking down the steps. "Morning," she called softly. He looked up from the feed bucket. "You're up early?" "I couldn't sleep long," she said. "The bed was too soft. I'm not used to that anymore." Samuel gave a small laugh under his breath. Most folks wouldn't complain about comfort. "It's not a complaint," she said, smiling faintly. "It's just strange." They worked side by side, in silence for a while. Grace brushed down one of the horses, a chestnut mare with a gentle eye. The animal leaned into her touch, as if recognizing something kindred weariness mixed with gentleness. Samuel leaned against the fence, watching her. "You've handled a horse before." "My father raised them when I was a girl," she said. "He used to say they could sense your heart before your words." "Sounds like a man who understood things," Samuel said. "He did," she replied quietly, though the world didn't always reward that. When the chores were done, they walked back toward the house. The rising sun cast long shadows, the air smelling faintly of hay and dust. Grace glanced toward Samuel, noticing the way he squinted against the light. His hat tilted low. He moved like someone used to working alone, every motion deliberate. Over breakfast, Lily chattered about the mare she'd helped feed, her eyes shining. Grace smiled at her daughter's joy, though part of her wondered how long it could last. Happiness had always felt temporary, like a season that passed too quickly. Samuel watched them both with quiet curiosity. "Finally," he said, "you plan to keep moving once you've saved enough." Grace looked up, startled by the question. "I hadn't thought that far," she admitted. "I suppose I just hoped to find a place where Lily could sleep without worry for a while." He nodded, stirring his coffee. "The world's rough out there, rougher for women alone." "I've learned that," she said softly, "but I also learned that some kindness still exists, even if it comes from strangers." His gaze met hers, steady but unreadable. "Not everyone out here's cruel. Mrs. Miller. Just tired. Same as you." She held his eyes for a moment longer than intended. Something in his voice, something tired but honest, made her chest ache. She looked away first, pretending to fix Lily's hair. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Grace cleaned the kitchen, humming an old hymn under her breath. The sound drifted through the house, filling the empty spaces with something warm. Samuel worked outside mending a gate, but every now and then he paused, listening without meaning to. When he came in for water, he found her standing on a stool, hanging clean curtains near the window. Light streamed through the thin fabric, catching dust in the air like tiny sparks. For a moment, the room felt alive again. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. Grace turned, startled, nearly losing her balance. Samuel moved forward instinctively, steadying her by the waist. For an instant, their faces were close enough that she could see the faint scar near his temple, the lines at the corners of his eyes. She stepped back quickly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, no harm done." Their eyes met again, and something unspoken passed between them. Something neither of them dared to name. Grace turned back to the curtains, pretending to smooth the edges, her heart beating faster than she wished it would. By late afternoon, a wagon appeared in the distance, a trader passing through, his mules kicking up dust along the trail. Samuel went out to meet him, leaving Grace and Lily on the porch. The man traded flour, salt, and news. Grace watched them talk from a distance, catching fragments of their words. When Samuel came back, he carried a small bundle. "Thought your girl might like this," he said, handing Lily a worn storybook. Lily's face lit up. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." Grace blinked, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged. "Couldn't have her reading the same Bible pages every night. Kids need stories that end happy once in a while." Grace's throat tightened. "That's very kind of you." Samuel didn't reply. He just tipped his hat and went back toward the barn. That evening, Grace sat by the fire with Lily, reading from the book. The girl's laughter echoed softly against the wooden walls. Samuel listened from his chair, pretending to read his newspaper. The warmth in the room felt different now, not just from the flames, but from something human returning to life. When Lily finally fell asleep in her mother's lap, Grace looked across the fire at Samuel. The flickering light painted his face in shades of gold and shadow. "You're a quiet man, Mr. Reed," she said softly. "Talk's cheap," he replied, "and silence keeps the peace." "Does it?" she asked. "Sometimes silence just hides the noise inside." He studied her carefully. "You speak like someone who's heard both kinds." "I have," she admitted, "and I'd take the noise of honesty over the quiet of pretending any day." He smiled faintly. "You've got courage, Mrs. Miller. Most folks lose that when life kicks them down." Grace shook her head. "It's not courage. It's just the only thing left when everything else is gone." The clock struck 8. Samuel rose, adjusting his hat, though he wasn't going anywhere. "You should rest," he said. "Morning comes early here." Grace nodded, lifting Lily carefully. "Good night, Mr. Reed." He paused by the door, glancing back at her. Night, ma'am." After she left the room, he stared at the fire for a long time, hearing her words echo in his head. Silence hides the noise inside. Upstairs, Grace laid Lily in bed, then sat for a while by the window. The stars stretched endless across the sky, and the faint sound of crickets filled the dark. She thought about Samuel's eyes, about the weight they carried. She wondered what kind of loss could make a man live in a house built for 3 and speak as if he'd already buried his own heart. In the stillness, she whispered a promise she didn't fully understand yet. "Maybe this time, we won't run." The wind pressed softly against the window pane, as if agreeing. The next day began with the quiet rhythm of life settling into something almost familiar. Grace rose before the sun, her hands moving with the calm certainty of routine, stoking the fire, heating water, slicing bread. The house no longer felt like a stranger's shelter. It felt like a place that might, one day, forgive her for being here. When Samuel came down from the loft, he paused in the doorway, watching her move about the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the room, mingling with the faint sweetness of frying apples. He hadn't tasted breakfast cooked by another person in years. Grace looked up. "You're up early, Mr. Reed." "Habit," he said, leaning a shoulder against the doorframe. "Smells better than what I usually burn in the mornings." She smiled lightly. "Then I'll consider that a compliment." He sat at the table, his hat pushed back, and for a moment the scene felt almost ordinary, like something from a life neither of them had ever managed to keep. Lily came bounding down the stairs, her hair a tangle of gold, her smile bright. "Morning, Mr. Reed." Samuel grinned. "Morning, little one. You ready to work for your breakfast?" Lily giggled. "I already helped Mama wash the eggs." Grace shook her head. "She means she stared at them until I cracked them." Samuel chuckled quietly, the sound warm and strange in his own ears. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed at breakfast. As they ate, the light streamed through the windows, soft and forgiving. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to relax, to imagine what it might be like if this peace could last. When the meal was done, Samuel said he had to ride into town for supplies. "You'll be all right here?" he asked. Grace nodded. "We'll manage fine. I'll finish the washing and mend that curtain in the sitting room." He studied her for a second longer than necessary, then gave a short nod. "If anyone comes by, don't open the door. Just keep quiet until I'm back." The seriousness in his tone made her chest tighten. "Is something wrong?" "Not exactly," he said, "but folks out here don't always take kindly to strangers." Grace understood more than she wanted to. "We'll stay inside." After he left, the ranch grew still again. The windmill creaked in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of sage. Grace gathered the laundry in a basket and stepped outside, her bare feet brushing against the cool grass. Lily followed, chasing a grasshopper until her laughter echoed across the yard. Grace smiled, her heart easing. She hadn't heard that sound since before the mines took her husband. Inside the house, she opened the curtains to let in more light. As she dusted the shelves near the fireplace, her hand brushed against the small framed photograph she'd noticed before. She hesitated, then picked it up. It showed a woman standing beside Samuel, a woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile. Between them was a boy, maybe 5 or 6, grinning proudly with a wooden toy horse in his hand. The photo was old, the edges faded, but the happiness in it was unmistakable. Grace felt a slow ache form in her chest. She set it back carefully, her fingers lingering on the frame. Mama Lily's voice broke her thoughts. "Who's that?" Grace glanced toward the photo again, then knelt beside her daughter. "Someone Mr. Reed used to love very much." Lily looked puzzled. "Where are they now?" Grace hesitated. "I think they're in heaven, sweetheart." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if that explained everything. She wandered off to play near the window, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. As the hours passed, Grace worked quietly. She mended torn fabric, wiped down the shelves, and swept the floors until the wood shone. But the image of the photo wouldn't leave her mind. She wondered how much of Samuel's silence came from that loss, the kind of loss that could hollow a person out from the inside. By late afternoon, the sound of hooves echoed from the road. Samuel rode back with the wagon half filled with supplies. Dust clung to his hat and shirt, and his expression was unreadable. Grace met him at the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything go well in town?" He nodded, "Well enough." But there was something different in his eyes, something wary. Grace decided not to ask. Instead, she helped him unload the sacks of grain and canned goods. As they worked, the sky began to darken with a promise of rain. Inside, Samuel dropped his gloves on the table. "Storm's coming," he said. "You should bring in the laundry before it hits." Grace went to the porch, the wind already rising. She hurried to unpin the clothes while Lily chased after a loose sheet, laughing as it danced in the wind. Thunder rolled in the distance. When she came back inside, her hair clung damply to her cheeks. Samuel was lighting the lanterns. "You can dry those by the fire," he said. "Thank you," Grace replied, hanging the linens near the hearth. As the rain began to fall in steady sheets, the house filled with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Samuel sat at the table, staring at the flames. Grace joined him after a while, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "You lost them, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "You saw the photo. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched it." "It's fine," he said after a pause. "They've been gone 5 years. Fever took them both, 3 days apart." Grace closed her eyes. "I can't imagine that kind of pain." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "You don't need to imagine. You carry your own kind." She didn't deny it. "Maybe that's why I understand the silence in this house." He finally met her gaze. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain drummed against the windows. The fire crackled softly, and the air between them seemed to hum with something neither could name. Lily stirred in her chair, yawning. Grace stood to carry her to bed. But as she passed Samuel, she paused. "You said last night that silence keeps the peace. I think sometimes it just keeps us lonely." Samuel didn't answer, but when she turned to go, he whispered, barely audible, "Maybe you're right." That night, the rain fell harder, washing the dust from the land. In her room, Grace watched the lightning flash across the plains and thought about the man downstairs, about the grief that bound him and the small, fragile kindness that had begun to grow between them. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was only passing through or if she'd already begun to stay. The rain didn't stop through the night. It came down in waves, rattling the roof, seeping through the cracks of old wood, soaking the world outside until everything smelled of wet soil and thunder. Grace lay awake long after Lily had fallen asleep, listening to the storm's rhythm. The wind sounded like voices, like memories that wouldn't rest. Sometime after midnight, a sharp crack split the air. She sat upright, heart pounding. Another flash followed, bright enough to turn the room white for an instant. The sound of hooves came next, wild, panicked. Grace threw on her shawl and ran downstairs. Samuel was already by the door, lantern in hand, pulling on his coat. "Fences down," he said. "The horse is spooked." "I'll help," Grace said quickly. He turned, frowning. "You'll stay inside. It's too dangerous." "I can hold the light," she insisted. "You can't fix a fence in the dark alone." He hesitated for only a moment before handing her a second lantern. "Stay close. Don't move off the path." The wind nearly tore the breath from her mouth as they stepped outside. Rain soaked her hair, her dress clinging to her legs. She could barely see beyond the light of her lantern. Samuel led the way, his silhouette cutting through the storm. They reached the corral, where 2 horses circled in panic, their hooves splashing mud. A section of the fence had collapsed beneath the weight of the wind. Samuel moved fast, calming the animals with low, steady words before guiding them back under the shelter. Grace held the lantern high, the light flickering against the rain. When the horses were safe, they began repairing the fence. Samuel's hands moved with practiced precision, tying wire, driving stakes into the ground. Grace steadied each post, her fingers numb but determined. The storm howled around them, but neither spoke. It was as if the night itself demanded silence. At one point, lightning struck close enough to shake the ground. Grace stumbled, the lantern slipping from her grasp. Samuel caught her by the arm, pulling her against him just as another gust roared past. For a moment, their faces were inches apart. the storm raging around them, but their eyes locked in quiet defiance of it. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice low. "Then neither should you," she answered. "But here we are." He looked at her for a heartbeat longer before releasing her arm. "You're stubborn." "So are you," she said. When they finally finished, both were drenched to the bone. Samuel took her hand to steady her as they made their way back to the house. Inside, the fire had nearly gone out. He crouched to rekindle it while Grace fetched dry towels from the kitchen. She handed him one, their fingers brushing. The contact lingered a moment too long. "Thank you," he murmured. Grace smiled faintly. "You'd do the same." They sat near the fire, wrapped in silence and the soft hiss of rain. The flames threw a warm glow across the room, and for the first time, Samuel's expression softened completely. "Not many would have stood out there like that," he said. "Most would have turned back the minute the thunder hit." "I stopped turning back a long time ago," she said quietly. He nodded, understanding. "You remind me of her sometimes." Grace looked up, surprised. "Your wife?" He nodded again. She wasn't afraid of storms either. Said they were just the earth washing itself clean. Grace's voice softened. "That's a beautiful way to think of it." "She was a beautiful woman," he said, his tone distant, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Kind in ways this world doesn't deserve." Grace listened in silence. The pain in his voice wasn't sharp anymore. It had dulled into something steady, something he carried like a scar. "What about your husband?" he asked after a moment. She hesitated. David was gentle. He had hands too soft for the work he did. But he did it anyway. He used to hum while he fixed things. Said it made the tools lighter. Samuel's brow furrowed. "You loved him?" "I did," she said simply. "And I miss him. But I also know that grief doesn't mean we stop living." Her words hung between them, like the quiet after thunder. Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think the dead would want us to move on?" Grace looked into the fire. "I think they'd want us to find peace, even if it's not with them anymore." Outside, the rain began to ease. The storm was breaking. They sat there a while longer, neither speaking. The fire popped softly. Grace's eyes felt heavy, but her heart felt strangely light, as if something unseen had shifted inside her. When she finally rose, Samuel stood too. "You should change into something dry," he said. She nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Reed." He looked at her. "Thank you for trusting me out there." He gave a small, tired smile. "You've earned that much." Upstairs, Grace peeled off her soaked dress and changed into one of the flannel shirts Samuel had offered her earlier that week. It hung loose on her frame, the scent of wood smoke clinging to it. She sat by the window, watching the last drops of rain slide down the glass. The world outside was quiet again, washed clean just as Samuel's wife had said. Downstairs. Samuel stared into the fire until the embers dimmed. He could still feel the warmth of her hand in his. It had been years since anyone had stood beside him in the storm, not out of duty, but choice. When he finally went to bed, he dreamt of laughter echoing through the house, of light spilling through open windows, of a woman's voice humming softly while the rain whispered against the walls. By morning, the air was clear and sweet, the land glistening with dew. The storm had passed, but something in both their hearts had begun to stir something fragile and alive. They didn't speak of it the next day, nor the one after, but every glance held a little more warmth, every silence a little less emptiness. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew the truth sometimes. The hardest storms aren't the ones outside, but the ones that finally break inside us. The morning after the storm was bright and unnervingly still. Dew sparkled on every blade of grass, and the air carried that rare scent of earth cleansed by rain. The ranch looked softer, almost peaceful. Grace stepped outside with a basket of linens to hang under the new sun, her bare feet sinking slightly into the damp soil. She could still hear the echo of the night before the thunder, the shouting, the way Samuel's hand had steadied hers. Oh, Lily ran ahead, her laughter skipping across the open yard. She was chasing a butterfly, her curls bouncing in the light. Grace smiled, the sight filling her chest with something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment, fragile but real. Samuel came out from the barn carrying a saddle. "Morning," he called. Grace turned, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Morning, Mr. Reed. The world looks brand new today." He smiled faintly. "Storm'll do that. Wash away what's heavy. Make things worth seeing again." Grace nodded, her eyes meeting his for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned back to the clothesline, pinning a sheet that fluttered gently in the wind. Samuel watched her from the porch, her quiet grace, the way she moved as if she belonged there all along. Around noon, while Grace prepared lunch, the sound of wagon wheels echoed from down the road. It wasn't unusual for traders to pass by, but something in the rhythm of the wheels, slow, deliberate, made Samuel set down his hammer and reach for his hat. He stepped out to the gate, his posture suddenly alert. Grace followed him to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The wagon stopped. A man climbed down tall, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed beard and a black coat that didn't quite fit the dusty landscape. His boots were polished, his hat too fine. His eyes, cold and gray, swept over the ranch before settling on Samuel. "Afternoon," the man said. "You Mr.?" Reed Samuel's tone was cautious. "Depends who's asking. Name's Henry Collins," the man replied. "I came looking for someone, a woman. Been traveling north from Helena." Grace froze at the doorway. Samuel's gaze flicked toward her, then back to the stranger. "What's your business with her?" Collins glanced past him, spotting Grace half hidden behind the post. A slow smile spread across his face. "There she is, Grace Miller." Lily peeked from behind her mother's skirt, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Grace's stomach tightened, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Collins," she said carefully, "what are you doing here?" "You left Helena owing money," he said, his tone slick, practiced. 2 months' rent and a promise you'd pay back what you took from my boarding house." Grace's face went pale. "I didn't take anything." Samuel stepped between them, his shoulders broad and solid. "You'd best lower your voice." Collins smirked. "Didn't mean to cause trouble. Mr. Reed, just looking to settle what's owed." "There's nothing owed," Grace said, her voice trembling but steady. "He's lying. I left because he—" She stopped herself, glancing at Lily. Samuel's jaw tightened. "You heard the lady. She's not going anywhere with you." Collins shifted his stance. "You got no claim to her. And if she's working here, I've got every right to tell the sheriff she's hiding from debt." Grace's hands clenched at her sides. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I would," he said, grinning, "unless someone makes it worth my while not to." Samuel stepped closer. His voice dropped low. "You take one more step, and I'll make sure you don't find the road back." For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other. The only sound was the creak of the windmill and Lily's quiet breathing. Finally, Collins raised his hands, feigning surrender. Didn't mean no offense. He said, "Just business, that's all. But word gets around fast out here. I'd hate for folks to think you're harboring trouble." Samuel didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the man until Collins climbed back onto his wagon and turned down the road. The wheels creaked slowly away until the sound vanished into the distance. When the dust finally settled, Grace let out a shaky breath. Her knees felt weak. Samuel turned to her, his voice softer. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Grace hesitated. "He's not lying about the rent. I owed him a little. But when my husband died, I couldn't pay. He offered to forgive the debt if she stopped, swallowing hard. If I'd do things no woman should be asked to do." Samuel's face darkened. "And when you refused, he made sure no one in town would hire me. I had no choice but to leave." Samuel's hands tightened at his sides. "You should have told me. I didn't want to bring you more trouble," she said quietly. "You've done enough already." He looked at her for a long time, then exhaled slowly. "You're safe here, Grace. No one's taking you or your girl off this land." Her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." "Samuel," he corrected softly. "You can call me Samuel." The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Grace kept glancing toward the road, half expecting the wagon to return. Samuel worked near the barn, his movements sharp, angry, his mind replaying every word the stranger had said. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Grace found him sitting on the porch steps, his hat resting on his knee. She approached slowly, the air cool around them. "I didn't mean for you to get caught in that," she said. He shook his head. "You didn't bring the trouble." "He did. Men like him feed on fear. You stop giving it. They starve." Grace sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "You speak like someone who knows that kind of man." He nodded. "Used to work cattle down near Dodge. Plenty of bullies with fancy boots. Some of them wear badges, some wear smiles." They fell silent for a while, listening to the sound of crickets. Lily was already asleep upstairs. The night was peaceful again, but a different kind of energy hung in the air. Protective, unspoken, alive. After a long pause, Samuel said quietly, "You don't owe that man a thing. You got a right to start over. Same as anyone." Grace turned to him. "You really believe that I do," he said, "and you should too." She smiled softly, her voice a whisper. "You make it sound so simple." "It ain't simple," he admitted, "but it's possible." The stars stretched wide over them, bright and endless. Grace leaned back slightly, breathing in the clean night air. For the first time since she'd left Helena, she felt something stronger than fear, something like belonging. Inside the house, the faint glow of the lamp flickered through the window, casting their shadows together across the porch. Neither noticed. For now, the quiet between them felt like safety. The next few days passed under a strange stillness. The air was heavy, like the quiet before another storm. Grace tried to move through her chores as though nothing had happened. But every time she heard the distant creak of a wagon or a dog bark from the hills, her chest tightened. Samuel noticed. He didn't press her with questions, but he began to linger nearby when she worked outside, his presence steady and wordless. It was the kind of protection that didn't need to be announced. It simply was. Lily, blissfully unaware of the danger that had brushed past them, played freely around the ranch again. She followed Samuel to the barn most mornings, asking endless questions about horses, tools, and the names of every bird that perched on the fence posts. "Why do the birds always come back after a storm?" she asked one afternoon, sitting cross-legged in the hay. Samuel glanced at her, his hands busy repairing a bridle. "Because they know the world still has something worth singing for." Lily smiled wide. "Like Mama's songs." He nodded. "Exactly like that." From the doorway, Grace watched the exchange, her heart softening. She had seen men who raised their voices more than their hands, men who measured their worth in anger. Samuel wasn't one of them. His silence wasn't cold. It was careful, the kind that comes from someone who's learned that speaking too soon can break fragile things. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Grace found Samuel still outside near the corral. The sky was streaked with pale moonlight, the air cool and calm. "You're keeping watch," she said quietly. He didn't turn, just making sure no one comes back. "You really think he might? I've seen men like him before. They don't like being told no." Grace stepped closer. "I don't want you risking trouble because of me." He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "You think I'd let someone threaten a woman and a child under my roof? I think you've done more than you should already." Samuel's voice lowered. "Grace, you're not a burden." He stopped himself, glancing away. "You're part of this place now, whether you meant to be or not." For a long moment, neither spoke. The night hummed with the soft sounds of crickets and wind through the grass. Grace felt the words she wanted to say rise in her chest, but she swallowed them back. Something about Samuel's steadiness made her want to trust again, yet she was terrified of what that might mean. Instead, she said, "I'll make sure to keep Lily close. If he comes again, I'll be ready." He shook his head. You won't have to be." Grace frowned slightly. "You can't protect everyone." "Samuel?" "No," he said softly, "but I can protect the one standing in front of me." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude didn't seem like enough. Later, when she returned inside, she stood for a long time in front of the old mirror near the stairs. The reflection staring back at her wasn't the same woman who had knocked on Samuel Reed's door weeks ago. There was still fatigue in her face, but her eyes no longer looked hollow. They looked alive. In the days that followed, the ranch found its rhythm again. Grace planted a small patch of vegetables behind the house. Samuel repaired the north fence. Lily collected wildflowers and arranged them in glass jars on every windowsill. The house began to look lived in again. But beneath that fragile peace, there lingered something unspoken. One evening, as the sky turned orange and violet, Grace came across Samuel near the barn, standing by an old wooden cross planted beneath a lone oak tree. She hadn't noticed it before weathered, half covered in wild grass. She approached quietly. "I didn't mean to intrude." He didn't move. "You're not." She looked at the cross, then at him. "Your wife and son." He nodded. "Buried them here. Couldn't stand to send them to town, not where the noise would drown out their rest." Grace's throat tightened. "You visit them often, every day," he said, "at least for a minute. Reminds me what's worth keeping alive." Grace looked down, her hands clasped. "You love them deeply. Still do," he said simply. She hesitated, then asked, "Does it hurt less now?" Samuel took a deep breath. "No, but the hurt changes shape. It stops tearing and just lives with you, like an old scar that aches when the rain comes." Grace nodded, her eyes glistening. "I think I understand." He glanced at her then. "You do. You've carried your own ghosts here." She gave a sad smile. I suppose I have, but lately they feel quieter. That's a good sign, he said. Means they're learning they don't own you anymore. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. The air between them was charged but gentle, a shared recognition of pain and survival. Then Lily's voice called from the porch. Mama, mister, Reed supper's ready. They both turned toward the sound. Grace smiled softly, her composure returning. I guess she's taken over my kitchen now. Samuel chuckled under his breath. Smart kid. Knows how to get people's attention. As they walked back toward the house, Samuel said quietly, That man Collins, if he shows up again, we'll handle it together. You're not facing him alone. Grace looked at him, her steps slowing. Why are you doing all this for us? Samuel. He stopped, considering his words. Because once, someone did the same for me, and I didn't thank them in time. She wanted to ask who, but the way his voice softened made her stay silent. Some answers weren't meant for questions. They were meant for understanding. That night, Grace sat by the fire after Lily had gone to bed. Samuel read quietly at the table. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was a calm, shared stillness. For the first time since her husband's death, Grace allowed herself to imagine a life not shaped by fear, a life where her daughter could grow, laugh, and be safe, a life where she could look at a man like Samuel Reed and not see danger, but possibility. When she finally rose to head upstairs, she turned back to him. Good night, Samuel? He looked up, meeting her eyes. Good night, Grace. And though neither said it aloud, they both felt it, the quiet shift in the air, the gentle beginning of something they hadn't dared to hope for. The sun climbed lazily over the Montana hills, casting long shadows across Silver Creek Ranch. The morning was warm, gentle, and deceptively calm. Grace was kneeling in the small garden behind the house, her hands deep in the soil, planting sprigs of thyme and wild carrots. Lily was nearby, collecting smooth pebbles to decorate the path. The scent of damp earth mixed with the faint sweetness of sage carried softly through the air. Inside the barn, Samuel was oiling the hinges of the old stall doors. The ranch had taken on a rhythm again, work, rest, laughter. It almost felt normal, but underneath, a quiet tension still pulsed, the unspoken fear that Henry Collins might return. By late morning, Grace noticed Samuel saddling his horse. Going into town again, she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. He nodded. Need supplies, and I'll have a word with the sheriff. Grace's brow furrowed. About Mr. Collins? Yes. He's not the type to quit easy. If he starts spreading lies about you, I want the sheriff to know the truth first. Grace hesitated. I don't want you caught up in my troubles. He met her eyes. Grace, sometimes doing nothing is the same as letting someone lose twice. You've run long enough. She didn't argue. Instead, she watched as he rode out, the dust rising beneath the horse's hooves. She stood there until the sound faded down the road. The day moved quietly. Grace mended a tear in Lily's dress, baked bread, and hummed softly as the smell of yeast and warmth filled the house. But around noon, Lily pointed toward the ridge. Mama, she said, there's a wagon coming. Grace's stomach dropped. She stepped onto the porch, squinting into the sunlight. The wagon was smaller than the one Collins drove, pulled by a single mule. As it came closer, she saw it wasn't Collins, but an older man with white hair and a kind face beneath a dusty hat. When he reached the gate, he tipped his hat. Afternoon, ma'am. Name's Dr. Ellis. I was told I might find Samuel Reed here. Grace exhaled slowly, relief flooding her chest. "He's in town. Doctor, can I help you?" The old man smiled. "I reckon you can. I've known Sam a long while. Brought him into this world. In fact, I was just passing through and thought I'd check on him. Haven't seen him since before the fever took his family." Grace nodded softly. "He's doing as well as anyone could after all that." Ellis studied her a moment. "You must be the woman folks have been whispering about in town." Grace stiffened slightly. What do they say, that he finally let someone stay under that roof again? The doctor's tone was gentle, not cruel. "Don't fret. Sam's a good man, but he carries his ghosts like old soldiers carry medals quietly, but always in sight." Grace smiled faintly. "I know. We all have our ghosts." The doctor tipped his hat again. "You take care of him, ma'am. He's stubborn as they come, but he's got a heart worth keeping." As the doctor's wagon rolled away, Grace stood in the yard, feeling the echo of his words, "a heart worth keeping." The phrase lingered with her long after he disappeared over the ridge. By evening, Samuel returned. His shoulders looked less tense, his expression easier. "Sheriff says Collins is known for pulling stunts like that," he told her as he dismounted. "They'll keep an eye out." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you." He smiled faintly. "Wasn't just for you. That kind of man poisons the whole town." Lily came running, waving a flower she'd picked. Samuel lifted her into his arms, laughing softly as she placed it in his hat. Grace watched them, warmth curling through her chest. That night, after supper, the house felt unusually alive. Samuel had agreed to let Lily show him how to read one of her new storybooks. His voice was steady, slow, a little rough around the edges, but Lily listened like he was telling her a secret. Grace sat quietly nearby, sewing, though her eyes lingered on the two of them more than her work. When the story ended, Lily climbed onto Samuel's knee. "Mr. Reed, were you ever scared when you were little?" He chuckled softly. "Plenty of times. What did you do?" He thought for a moment. "I listened to my pa's voice. He said fear's just the world asking if you still want to be here. So I told it yes." Lily smiled sleepily. "That's brave." Samuel glanced at Grace. "It's just honest." After Lily was asleep, Grace and Samuel stepped outside. The night sky stretched endless above them, filled with silver light. The sound of the creek drifted faintly through the stillness. "You didn't have to go to the sheriff," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." Grace turned to him. Why, he met her gaze steadily. "Because I've been alone too long, Grace, and I'm tired of pretending I don't care about what happens here." The words caught her off guard. She wanted to answer, but her throat felt tight. The air between them pulsed with something fragile and real. After a moment, she whispered, "I don't know what this is, Samuel. I only know it feels like the first thing that's been right in a long time." He took a slow step closer. "Then maybe that's all it needs to be." They stood there in silence, the stars burning quietly overhead. For a brief moment, neither carried the weight of their pasts. They were just two souls standing in the middle of the world, both learning that healing didn't have to be loud. It could be as soft as breathing the same air. When Grace finally went inside, her heart was unsteady but full. Samuel remained on the porch, looking toward the horizon where the moon hung low and steady. For the first time since the fever years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for something to end. He felt like someone who had begun again. The following morning brought a chill breeze and the faint smell of smoke from faraway chimneys. Autumn was creeping into Montana early that year, curling its cool fingers around the edges of every sunrise. Grace noticed it first when she stepped outside to fetch water. The grass glistened with dew, and her breath rose faintly in the air. Samuel was already out in the barn, tightening the harness on one of the horses. "Heading into town again?" she asked as she approached. He nodded, his movements brisk. "Need to trade for feed before the prices climb. You and Lily'll be all right here." Grace smiled faintly. "We'll be fine. The garden still needs tending, and the bread won't bake itself." He glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Don't open the door for anyone, not even if they say they're a friend." "I know," she said gently. "You don't have to keep reminding me." Samuel hesitated, his hat in his hands, as though he wanted to say something more, but didn't know how. Finally, he placed the hat on his head, nodded once, and mounted his horse. Grace watched him ride out, the sound of hooves fading down the dirt road. Hours passed quietly. Lily spent the morning drawing pictures in the dust near the porch, while Grace kneaded dough and hummed a soft tune from her childhood. The air smelled of yeast and sunlight. For a while, it felt like the danger of Henry Collins had been washed away by time and distance. But just as she was taking the bread from the oven, Grace saw a shadow moving along the fence line. Her heart jumped. She wiped her hands and stepped onto the porch, squinting toward the road. A man stood there, lean, scruffy, his hat pulled low. Not Collins, but someone she didn't recognize. He raised a hand. "Mornin', ma'am. I'm looking for Samuel Reed." Grace's voice was cautious. "He's not home. What's your business?" The man's smile was thin. "Just delivering a message from town. Sheriff asked me to come." Grace hesitated, torn between courtesy and caution. "You can leave it with me." He nodded and approached the fence, but didn't cross it. His boots sank slightly in the wet soil. "Tell Mr. Reed there's been talk. Some folks say he's taken up with a widow from Helena who's run from her debts. Sheriff thought he should know before rumors get louder." Grace's stomach twisted. "Who's saying that?" The man shrugged. "Hard to say. Word travels fast. Collins' wagon was seen near Dawson's Creek yesterday. Might be nothing. Might be trouble." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and turned away, his figure vanishing into the distance as quickly as it had come. Grace stood frozen for a long time, her hands trembling. He's still out there. When Samuel returned that evening, the light was already fading. Grace met him halfway to the barn, her face pale. "What happened?" he asked immediately. She told him everything, the stranger, the message, the mention of Collins' name. As she spoke, Samuel's expression hardened. "He's trying to stir the town," Samuel muttered. "Spread rumors until no one wants you here. Then he'll come collect what he thinks he owns." Grace's voice wavered. "What if people believe him?" "They won't," Samuel said firmly. "The sheriff knows you're innocent, and anyone who's seen this place knows there's no shame in you." Grace looked away. Sometimes truth doesn't matter to people who like gossip better. Samuel reached out, his hand brushing her arm. "It matters to me." The quiet conviction in his voice made her chest ache. She wanted to believe him, but fear had been her companion for too long. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps. She rose before dawn, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went to the porch. The stars were fading, and the horizon glowed faintly gold. She didn't hear Samuel come up behind her until he spoke. "You should be resting." "I couldn't," she said softly. It feels like he's everywhere, even when he's not. Samuel leaned against the post beside her. Fear'll do that. Make ghosts out of shadows. I'm tired of being afraid, she whispered. He looked at her, his voice low. Then stop running. Stay. Grace turned to him, startled. Stay here, he said. You and Lily. This ranch has got room. It's quiet, safe. You don't have to keep wandering. Her breath caught. Samuel, I can't. People would talk. They already are. Let them, he said simply. They don't live here. We do. The firmness in his tone left her speechless. She looked at him in the soft morning light, saw the quiet resolve in his eyes, and realized he meant every word. Lily's voice broke the silence, calling from the window upstairs. Mama, breakfast. Grace smiled faintly. Seems she's already decided we're home. Samuel chuckled softly, a sound that warmed the chill air. Smart girl. Later that day, they worked side by side, repairing a section of the corral. The rhythm of shared labor eased the tension between them. Grace noticed how Samuel would glance toward the road every so often, his hand brushing near the holster at his hip. He hadn't said it aloud, but she knew he was watching for Collins. By evening, they were both covered in dust, their clothes streaked with sweat and sunlight. Grace laughed quietly as she wiped her hands. I can't remember the last time I worked this hard and didn't feel hopeless afterward. Samuel smiled, his eyes crinkling. That's because this kind of work builds, not just survives. She met his gaze and felt that quiet, steady pull between them again, the one she'd been trying so hard to ignore. When the stars came out, they sat on the porch with Lily between them, the little girl half asleep against her mother's arm. Grace's voice was soft as she said, Do you think a person can really start over? Samuel looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of town lights flickered in the distance. I think starting over's just living forward instead of looking back. Grace smiled gently. You make it sound easy. He shook his head. It's not. But it's better than letting someone else write your story. The words settled deep inside her, like roots taking hold in new soil. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether Collins would return, or what the town might say, but for the first time, she felt steady enough to face it. As the wind rustled the grass and the night deepened, Samuel reached across and took her hand. No words, no promises, just a quiet understanding. 2 lives, scarred by loss, slowly learning to believe in morning again. The next week passed with the weight of waiting pressing down on every sunrise. Grace could feel it in the way Samuel's jaw tightened whenever a rider passed on the distant road, in how he now checked the gate locks twice before dusk. Even Lily seemed to sense something unspoken, growing quieter when the sky turned orange each evening. Life on the ranch went on. Chores still needed doing. Horses still needed tending, but the calm was a fragile one, stretched thin like glass before it cracks. One late afternoon, the first signs of trouble appeared. Grace was in the kitchen, kneading dough while Lily colored on the floor, when Samuel burst through the door. His hat was askew, his hands streaked with dust. Pack a few things, he said sharply. Grace froze. What happened? He moved quickly to the window, peering toward the horizon. Collins was in town today, drunk and running his mouth in the saloon. Said he'd be heading this way before dark. Grace's blood turned cold. Is he alone? Don't know. Sheriff said he left with a couple of rough hands from the mines. They're looking for the woman who stole from him. Samuel spat the words like they burned. He's not coming to talk. Grace's hands trembled. We should leave. Take Lily, and Samuel turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "If we run now, he'll never stop. The only way men like him learn is when they hit something that won't break." But he stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Grace, I need you to trust me. You and Lily stay inside. If anything happens, take her and head for the creek path behind the barn. You remember the one." She nodded faintly. He gave her a small, almost reassuring smile. "Good. I'll handle the rest." The hours crawled by. The sun sank lower, painting the fields in shades of blood orange and gold. Grace tried to keep Lily calm, reading her one of the small storybooks Samuel had found at the mercantile. But every creak of the wind made her heart skip. Then, just after dusk, came the sound hoofbeats. Slow at first, then louder, echoing off the hills. Grace peeked through the curtain. 3 riders approached the ranch, silhouettes against the dimming light. One of them, even from a distance, she recognized Henry Collins. He rode like he owned the ground beneath him, his posture straight, smug. The men beside him were rougher, meaner, one chewing tobacco, the other gripping a rifle across his lap. Samuel stepped out onto the porch before they reached the gate, his stance relaxed but ready. The fading light caught the edge of his revolver holster. "Evening. Gentlemen," he called evenly. Collins smirked. "Mighty fine property you got here. Read. Shame it's about to be tied up in a legal matter." "Don't think I heard of any legal matter involving trespassing," Samuel said. The man with the rifle chuckled. "Heh, guess we'll just have to settle it private then." Grace clutched Lily close behind the curtain. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might give her away. Collins dismounted, boots crunching in the dirt. "I just came for what's mine. The woman inside Grace Miller. She owes me, and I'll see her pay it." Samuel's voice stayed low. "You touch a single board on this property, and you'll regret it." Collins laughed, stepping closer. "You really think you can keep her from me? She's a liar. Read. Took money. Ran off. Played the widow card to find herself another fool. You can't save her from what she is." Grace's stomach twisted. But before she could move, Samuel took one slow step forward. "You done talking." Collins grinned wider. "What? Gonna shoot me in front of the law?" Samuel's voice was quiet, almost dangerous. "I don't need to shoot you, Collins. I just need you to understand what kind of man you're dealing with." He took another step closer, and the last of the daylight caught his face. The calm determination in his eyes was colder than fear. The man with the rifle shifted nervously. "Maybe we should shut it," Collins snapped. "He's bluffing." Samuel didn't blink. "Try me." The silence that followed stretched long enough for even the wind to hold its breath. Then, from the house, came Lily's small, frightened voice. Mama Collins' smirk twisted. "So that's the brat." Grace couldn't hold back any more. She pushed open the door and stepped out onto the porch. "That's enough. Henry?" Samuel's head turned sharply. "Grace." She ignored him, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. "You don't get to come here and scare my daughter. You don't get to twist the truth anymore." Collins barked a laugh. "Truth. You ran from your debts, from your husband's failures. My husband died trying to keep food on our table," she said, her voice rising. "You tried to buy my shame with your money. I left because I'd rather starve honest than live under you. For the first time." Collins' expression faltered, but his anger returned quick. "You'll regret talking like that." Samuel stepped forward again, his voice sharp as a blade. "No, you will." He moved with a speed that stunned even the hired men. In one motion, he drew his revolver and fired a single warning shot that struck the ground inches from Colin's boot. The horses spooked, rearing back. "Next one goes higher," Samuel said evenly. The men froze. The one with the rifle muttered something, swung back onto his horse, and rode off without waiting. The second followed soon after, cursing under his breath. Colin stood there, his face pale, his confidence cracked. "This ain't over. Reed," he hissed. "You'll wish you never crossed me." Samuel holstered his gun. "Then you best start wishing fast." Collins mounted his horse, glaring once more before kicking up dust and disappearing into the dark. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Grace realized she was shaking. Samuel turned to her, his expression softening. "You shouldn't have come out," he said quietly. "I couldn't hide," she whispered. "Not again." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you're braver than most." Lily peeked from behind the door, eyes wide. Samuel crouched beside her and smiled gently. "It's all right, sweetheart. He's gone." Grace stood there, the night air cool against her face, realizing what had just happened. For the first time since her husband's death, she hadn't run. She'd stood her ground. And Samuel, he hadn't just defended her. He'd believed in her. Inside, when the house was quiet again, Grace found Samuel by the window, staring out at the stars. She walked up beside him. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't look away from the horizon. "You don't owe me thanks, Grace. You just owe yourself the chance to stop being afraid." Her eyes shimmered. "Maybe I'm starting to." And for a long while, they stood in silence, two survivors of storms inside and out, watching the night hold its breath around them. The dawn that followed was eerily quiet. No birds sang, no wind moved the tall grass that bordered the ranch. The world seemed to hold its breath after what had happened the night before. Grace awoke to the smell of smoke, not from the stove, but from outside. Her heart leapt in her chest. She rushed to the window and saw a faint plume rising from the far edge of the pasture. For one terrifying moment, she thought Collins had come back. But then Samuel appeared, riding fast, a wet cloth around his neck, his shirt damp with sweat and ash. She hurried to the porch just as he pulled up. "Fire's out," he said, breathing hard. Grass caught near the fence line. Probably from that warning shot last night. Grace covered her mouth. "Is it bad?" He shook his head. "Could have been worse. Just a small patch. But it'll take hours to clear the debris. I'll need to keep watch for sparks." "Let me help," she said immediately. He hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've done enough. You and Lily need rest." She frowned. "I can work. Samuel, I'm not made of glass." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "No, you're not." "All right, grab some gloves. We'll start near the south fence. By mid-morning." The two of them were side by side, hauling charred fence posts and stamping out smoldering bits of grass. The smell of burnt earth clung to their clothes. Sweat ran down Grace's back. But she didn't stop. Every time Samuel turned to look at her, she met his gaze with quiet determination. "You keep working like this," he said, "and I'll have to put you on the payroll." Grace smiled faintly, her cheeks streaked with dirt. "I thought I already was." "You're not getting paid enough, then." "Maybe the view makes up for it," she teased. He looked at her, surprised by the playfulness in her tone, then laughed a rare, warm sound that seemed to melt something heavy in the air. "Careful, Grace Miller. Keep talking like that, and I'll think you're getting used to this place." She met his eyes. "Maybe I am." For a long time, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't strained anymore. It felt steady, comfortable, like a song they both knew the rhythm to. By afternoon, the fire line was completely cleared. Samuel doused the last bit of smoke with water from the trough, then leaned against the fence, wiping his brow. "You all right?" he asked her. Grace nodded. "Tired, but it's the kind of tired that feels good." He smiled slightly. "You earned it." Before she could answer, they both heard the faint rattle of wagon wheels. Grace's heart tightened again. Samuel's expression darkened. But when the wagon came into view, it wasn't Collins. It was Sheriff Walt Hensley, a broad man with a gray beard and kind eyes. He waved as he pulled up. "Morning. Reed. Mrs. Miller." Grace nodded politely. "Sheriff." He climbed down slowly, dusting off his coat. "Heard about the ruckus last night. Word travels faster than common sense around here." Samuel's jaw tightened. Collins was here. He brought 2 men with him. "I figured as much," the sheriff said. "They rode through town just after midnight, looking riled up and humiliated. Guess they didn't find what they came for." Samuel's voice was flat. "They found enough." The sheriff glanced between them, then sighed. "Look, I don't think Collins will try again soon. But men like him, they don't forget easily. You'll want to keep your rifle close for a while." "I always do," Samuel said. Then the sheriff turned to Grace. "Ma'am, I want you to know we've checked your record. Everything that man said was smoke. You're clean as snow." Grace's throat tightened. "Thank you, Sheriff." He tipped his hat. "Folks around here talk, but most of them don't mean harm. They'll come around once they see the truth of things." After he left, Samuel and Grace stood watching the dust trail fade behind the wagon. Grace exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Do you think he's right?" she asked quietly. "Do you think Collins will stop?" Samuel shook his head. "No, but I think now he knows he's outnumbered." She looked at him, her expression softening. "You make it sound like you fought this kind of fight before." "I have," he said simply. "Too many times." Grace hesitated, then asked, "You said once someone helped you when you were younger. What did you mean?" Samuel leaned against the fence, his gaze far away. "My pa died when I was 16. Left me with debts and a temper I didn't know how to control. I got in with some rough men for a while, drank, fought, nearly ended up behind bars. Then one night, a rancher named Ellis, Dr. Ellis's brother, found me bleeding outside a saloon. He dragged me to his place, patched me up, and gave me work instead of judgment. Told me, a man's worth isn't what he's done, but what he's willing to do next." Grace listened quietly, her eyes full of something deep and tender. "You never forgot that." He shook his head. "No, and I figure I owe someone else the same chance." Their eyes met, and this time, Grace didn't look away. The world around them seemed to blur the faint rustle of the wind, the smell of earth, the distant cry of a hawk. "Samuel," she began softly, "you don't have to fix me. I'm not trying to," he said. "I just don't want to see you fight the world alone anymore." Something inside her broke open then, not from pain, but from release. For years, she had carried her fear like a stone in her chest. Now, standing beside him, she realized it was finally starting to lift. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Grace found Samuel sitting by the fire, a cup of coffee in his hands. She sat across from him, her voice low. "You know, when I came here, I thought I was just looking for work, a place to rest for a while. But now, she trailed off, unsure how to finish. Samuel looked at her gently. Now she met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I think I was meant to find this place. You, the quiet, the chance to breathe again. He said nothing for a long moment, then nodded. Sometimes that's all we're really looking for, a place to stop running. Grace smiled faintly. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, he said, but it's worth it. As the fire crackled softly between them, neither noticed how late it had grown. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't yet said, and everything they finally didn't need to. Outside, the night wind carried away the last scent of smoke. The land, like them, was healing. The first frost came early that year. Silver Creek Ranch woke beneath a thin veil of white, the grass stiff with ice, the air cold enough to make each breath visible. Grace stood by the window before dawn, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the world glitter in quiet stillness. Inside, the house had taken on the gentle rhythm of family life. Lily's drawings now covered one wall near the kitchen, each one showing horses, mountains, and a stick figure version of herself between two taller figures, Grace and Samuel. Grace hadn't asked her to draw that, but when she saw it, her heart had swelled and ached all at once. Samuel came in from outside, stamping the frost from his boots. Cold enough to freeze a man's breath solid, he said, setting down a bucket of water. Grace smiled softly. You say that every year, he chuckled. Probably, but it's true, every time. As the fire crackled in the stove, the warmth filled the room again. Grace poured him a cup of coffee, the steam curling in the pale morning light. There was a new ease between them now, a quiet companionship that had grown naturally, like roots beneath the soil. But peace has a way of being fragile. Later that morning, as Samuel was mending a saddle strap, a rider appeared in the distance carrying something in his hand. Grace shaded her eyes against the bright frost as the man dismounted and handed Samuel an envelope. Letter from Helena, he said. Name on it says Grace Miller. Grace felt her stomach tighten. She took the letter with cold fingers, staring at the familiar handwriting. Who sent this? The writer shrugged. Didn't say. Just left it at the post. When he left, Samuel watched her carefully. You all right? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, breaking the seal with trembling hands. The paper inside was yellowed, folded twice, and smelled faintly of tobacco. Her eyes moved across the page, and as she read, her breath caught. It wasn't from Collins. It was from someone she hadn't heard from in nearly 2 years. David's brother, Thomas Miller. Grace, I don't know if this letter will find you, but you deserve to know. Henry Collins has been spreading his lies across the county. He told everyone you ran with stolen money, that you abandoned David's debts, but the truth came out last month. Collins forged some of those papers, used your name to cover his gambling losses. The sheriff here is building a case. If you want to clear your name fully, come back to Helena. You are always stronger than you thought. Don't let men like him tell your story. Thomas. Grace folded the letter slowly, pressing it against her chest. For a long time, she couldn't speak. Samuel stepped closer. Bad news? She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. The opposite. It's proof I never owed him anything. Collins forged it all. Samuel's expression softened. Then you're free. Grace let out a shaky laugh that turned into tears. Free. She said it again, as if the word itself felt foreign. All this time I've been running from a ghost that wasn't even mine." Samuel took the letter gently from her hands and read it. When he finished, he looked at her, something proud and tender in his gaze. "You don't have to go back there to prove anything. But if you want to, I'll ride with you." Grace hesitated, torn between gratitude and fear. "I don't know if I could face that place again." "You don't have to face it alone," he said. She nodded slowly, a quiet strength beginning to rise in her chest. That night, after Lily was asleep, Grace sat by the fire, turning the letter over in her hands. Samuel was carving a small wooden horse at the table, the rhythmic sound of his knife soft and steady. "What will you do?" he asked finally. Grace stared into the flames. "For years I thought justice wasn't meant for women like me. But if I walk away now, Collins wins again. Maybe it's time I stop being afraid of my own past." Samuel's knife paused mid-stroke. "Then we'll go together." She looked up, startled. "You'd leave the ranch for a while," he said. "It'll still be here when we get back. Besides, sometimes a man's got to stand with someone who's stood alone too long." Her eyes shimmered. "You don't owe me that, Samuel." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I want to." 2 days later, the three of them set out at dawn. Grace, Samuel, and little Lily bundled in the back of the wagon. Beneath thick blankets, the road stretched long and pale through the open country. Frost sparkled on the fields like 1,000 tiny mirrors. As they rode, Grace felt both anxious and alive. The closer they came to Helena, the louder her heart beat, not just from fear of Collins, but from the weight of everything this journey meant. By late afternoon, the town appeared on the horizon, familiar but distant, like a ghost from another life. They stopped at the sheriff's office. Thomas was there waiting, older, thinner, but with the same kind eyes she remembered. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile. "Grace." She stepped down, tears already gathering. "It's been so long." He took her hands. "Too long. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I didn't know what Collins had done until it was almost too late." She shook her head. "You have nothing to be sorry for." The sheriff came forward, a tall woman named Martha Hale, with a sharp gaze that softened only slightly when she spoke. "Mrs. Miller, I've read your file. We've got enough to bring charges against Collins now. If you'll give a statement, we can put this to rest." Grace's voice was steady. "I'll do it." As she signed her name, something inside her finally unclenched. The pen shook slightly in her hand, but when she finished, her signature looked bold and certain. Afterward, as she stepped outside, the late sun bathed the town in amber light. Samuel stood by the wagon, Lily in his arms. Grace walked toward them, her steps light, her heart finally still. "It's done," she said softly. Samuel smiled. "Then let's go home." She looked at him, realizing that for the first time in years, the word home meant something real again. On the ride back, Lily fell asleep in her mother's lap. Grace brushed a curl from her daughter's face and whispered, "It's over." Samuel glanced at her, his voice low. "No, Grace, it's just beginning." And for once, she believed him. The town square of Helena had never looked so alive. It was early morning, and the sun's pale gold light spilled over the wooden rooftops, glinting off frosted windows and dusting the courthouse steps with warmth. Grace stood at the bottom of those steps, her gloved hands clenched tight around a folded piece of paper, her written testimony. Beside her, Samuel adjusted the collar of his coat. "You don't have to do this today," he said softly. The sheriff said the case can proceed without you if you'd rather go back to the ranch. Grace shook her head, her gaze steady. I ran long enough. Samuel? This time I'm staying until the truth has a voice. Hey, he studied her face, the calm determination in her eyes, the quiet strength that had replaced fear. Then I'll be right here when you speak it. Inside the courthouse. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and winter coats. Townsfolk filled the benches, merchants, farmers, and women whispering behind gloved hands. At the front sat Judge Morris, his white beard neat, his eyes sharp and unreadable. Henry Collins was already there, seated beside his lawyer. He looked thinner than before, his fine coat wrinkled, his confidence worn down, but not gone. When his eyes met Grace's, his lips curled into a smirk. Mrs. Miller, he drawled, just loud enough for her to hear. Didn't expect you'd have the courage to show. Grace met his gaze without flinching. You never expected much of me at all. Henry? That's why you lost before the trial even began. Samuel's hand brushed lightly against her back, a silent anchor. When the proceedings began, the courtroom fell into a hush. Sheriff Martha Hale was called first. She stood tall as she described the evidence, the falsified documents, the handwriting analysis proving Collins had forged Grace's signature, and witness statements from men who'd seen him gambling away the supposed debt. Each word landed like a hammer. Collins shifted uneasily, his bravado cracking. Then Grace was called to the stand. As she walked forward, every eye followed her. Her boots clicked softly against the wooden floor, and the sound seemed to echo through her chest. She took her seat, the folded statement trembling slightly in her hands. Mrs. Miller, the judge began, you may speak in your own words. She took a breath, steadying herself. Your Honor, I was married to David Miller for 10 years. We had little, but we had peace. When he died, I was left with nothing but a roof over my head and a child to feed. Henry Collins offered me work at his boarding house. He said he'd help until I could stand on my own. She paused, her voice steady but full of quiet pain. But his help came with conditions, things no decent woman should be asked to trade. When I refused, he spread lies. Said I'd stolen from him. No one would hire me after that. So I left. The courtroom was silent except for the crackle of the fireplace. I didn't run because I was guilty. She continued, her voice growing stronger. I ran because I thought no one would believe me. Because women like me, widows, mothers, poor, don't get to fight back. But I was wrong. There's still justice in this world if we're brave enough to reach for it. When she finished, the judge nodded slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Collins' lawyer tried to rattle her during cross-examination, asking if she had any proof beyond a letter from Thomas. Grace simply reached into her coat and handed him the second document, a statement signed by 3 witnesses, men who'd come forward after learning what Collins had done. Oh, the lawyer paled. Collins' composure shattered. By midday, the verdict was clear. Judge Morris's gavel struck hard. Henry Collins, you are hereby found guilty of forgery, fraud, and defamation. You will serve a sentence of no less than 3 years under state law. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Collins' face twisted with rage. You think this makes you better than me? He hissed at Grace as the sheriff led him away. You'll still be a widow in the dirt, and he'll leave you like the rest. Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. The difference, Collins, is she's not the one crawling out of this room in chains. Outside. The sunlight was brighter than before. Grace blinked against it, breathing deeply, as if for the first time in years. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of snow from the mountains. Thomas met her at the steps. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." He smiled, tears glinting in his eyes. David would have been proud. That evening, as the town quieted and lamps flickered to life, Grace and Samuel stopped by the small inn where they'd spent the night before. Lily was asleep upstairs, clutching her wooden horse. In the glow of the fire, Grace sat beside Samuel, the silence between them soft and familiar. "It's strange," she said after a while. "All this time, I thought freedom would feel loud like thunder. But it's just quiet." Samuel nodded. "Quiet's what peace sounds like." She looked at him then, really looked the way the firelight softened his rough edges, the way his eyes carried both weariness and warmth. "What now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Now we go home." Grace hesitated, and after that he met her gaze, his voice low. "After that, maybe we stop pretending that home's just a place. Maybe it's people." Her breath caught. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his. "I think I stopped pretending a while ago." Outside, snow began to fall soft, slow flakes drifting through the lamplight. Grace turned toward the window, watching them dance in the quiet. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a woman haunted by the past. She felt like a woman who had walked through it and found something waiting on the other side. Not rescue, not salvation, but something far rarer. Belonging. And beside her, Samuel Reed, the man who had once stood alone in a world of ghosts, felt something he hadn't in years, peace that didn't come from silence, but from being understood. The road back to Silver Creek was long, winding, and lined with the muted gold of late autumn grass. The air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the sky stretched wide and pale above them, a blue so thin it looked almost like glass. Grace sat beside Samuel on the wagon bench. Lily bundled in blankets behind them, softly humming a tune that drifted through the cold air. Helena faded into the distance behind them, shrinking until it became just another cluster of rooftops swallowed by the horizon. Grace didn't look back. She had spent too much of her life glancing over her shoulder. Now, she only wanted to see what lay ahead. Samuel held the reins loosely. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. "Feels different, don't it?" he said, his voice calm and low. Grace turned toward him. "What does riding home when you've got something worth going back to?" She smiled faintly, her breath clouding in the chill. "Yes, it does." They traveled in companionable silence for a while. The clatter of wheels and the soft thud of hooves were the only sounds. The land rolled open on both sides, wide plains stretching toward distant mountains dusted with snow. At midday, they stopped by a creek for lunch. Samuel unhitched the horse while Grace spread a small blanket on the grass. Lily hopped down, her cheeks pink from the cold, and ran to toss pebbles into the water. Grace watched her daughter, then turned to Samuel. "Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if the fever hadn't taken them?" He paused, leaning against the wagon. "Every day," he said simply, "but not the way I used to. Used to think life ended that night. Now I know it just changed its shape." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "You still visit them. The graves I will," he said. "But this time, I'll have something better to tell them. That I finally stopped living like a ghost." Her eyes softened. They'd be proud of that. He met her gaze. You think so, I know so. A gentle smile tugged at his lips. Funny. You talk like you've known them all your life. In a way. I feel like I have, she said quietly. They're part of the man who saved me. The words hung between them, warm despite the cold. Samuel looked down, tracing the rim of his cup with his thumb, then said softly, Grace, I didn't save you. You did that yourself. Maybe, she said, but you reminded me that I was worth saving. When they resumed their journey, the mood between them had shifted again, not tense, but heavy with unspoken things. Every glance felt like a conversation that hadn't quite found its words yet. As the ranch came into view near sundown, Grace felt her throat tighten. The familiar outline of the barn, the weathered fence, and the small plume of smoke curling from the chimney. It all looked unchanged, yet different. For the first time, she saw it not as a place she was borrowing, but as a place that belonged to her heart. Lily squealed with joy from the back. We're home, Samuel smiled. Sounds right when she says it. Grace laughed softly. It does. They unloaded the wagon together. Samuel carried the bags inside while Grace lit the stove, the warmth spreading through the house in slow, comforting waves. The smell of burning pine filled the air. After supper, Lily fell asleep almost instantly by the fire. Her little hands curled around her wooden horse. Grace tucked a quilt around her and then sat beside Samuel, who was staring quietly into the flames. She's happy here, Grace said softly. She's safe here, he replied. And so are you. Grace watched the firelight dance across his face, the way it softened his features, and felt something stir deep inside her. For months she'd fought against the idea of depending on anyone, but now she realized this wasn't dependence, it was trust. The rare kind that grows only after everything else has been burned away. I don't know what comes next, she said after a long silence. I don't even know what I want, not exactly. Samuel's voice was steady. You don't have to. You just keep living. The rest figures itself out. Grace smiled faintly. You make life sound simple. He looked at her, his eyes gentle. It's not simple, Grace, but it's honest. That's what makes it worth living. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the warmth of the fire, the steady sound of wind outside, and the quiet awareness that something had shifted between them for good. After a while, Samuel stood. I should check the barn before bed. Storm's rolling in tomorrow. Grace nodded, but before he could reach the door, she said softly, Samuel. He turned, and she rose from her chair, stepping closer. The light flickered against her face, catching the faint shimmer in her eyes. Thank you, she said, not just for today, for all of it, for believing me when no one else did. He studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. You didn't need believing, Grace. You just needed reminding. And with that, he stepped out into the cold, the door closing gently behind him. Grace stood for a while, watching the fire fade. She felt the exhaustion of the day settle into her bones, but it wasn't the same kind of tired she used to know, not the bone-deep weariness of survival, but the peaceful ache of a life finally finding its rhythm again. When she went upstairs to check on Lily, the child was still fast asleep, breathing softly. Grace brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead and whispered, We made it, my love. Downstairs, Samuel returned quietly and placed a bundle of kindling by the hearth. His gaze fell on the drawings on the wall, one in particular, the one of 3 stick figures holding hands. He smiled faintly, a warmth rising in his chest. Later that night, as the snow began to fall outside, covering the land in a hush of white, Grace stirred in her bed. For a moment, she thought she heard the faint creak of footsteps downstairs, then the steady rhythm of logs being added to the fire. She smiled to herself and closed her eyes again. The ranch breathed with quiet life, the sound of the wind, the soft crackle of fire, and the slow, steady beat of hearts that had found their way through storms and silence back to something simple and true: home. By mid-December, winter had fully claimed Silver Creek Ranch. The fields lay buried beneath thick layers of snow, and the fences wore crowns of frost. Each morning began in silence, the kind only snow can bring, a stillness so deep it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Grace had grown to love that silence. It was no longer empty or lonely. It was peaceful. The house had become a home now, full of life and warmth. The scent of coffee and wood smoke mingled in the air. Lily's laughter echoed through the rooms as she chased the family's new barn cat, a black and white stray she'd named Pepper. Samuel was outside most days, mending gates or cutting firewood, his breath visible in the cold air. Grace often watched him from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. There was something quietly reassuring about the sight of him, steady, strong, patient. That afternoon, the wind began to rise. Grace stepped out onto the porch to bring in the laundry she'd hung earlier, the wooden planks creaking beneath her boots. The air was sharp, biting her cheeks pink. Samuel came up from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Storm's moving fast," he said, glancing toward the dark horizon. "We'll be snowed in by nightfall." Grace looked at the sky, heavy with low gray clouds. "Do we have enough firewood?" He nodded. "Plenty. I just brought in another load. But we might lose power for a while, so we'll light the lamps early." The storm came in sooner than expected. By dusk, wind howled around the house, rattling the shutters. Snow drove sideways across the fields, turning the world beyond the windows into a blur of white. Inside, the little house glowed golden. The fire crackled, the oil lamps flickered, and Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, coloring with a stub of blue pencil. Grace stirred a pot of stew on the stove, the smell of herbs filling the room. Samuel sat nearby, mending a broken bridle strap, his quiet presence grounding everything around him. As the night deepened, the storm grew fiercer. The wind screamed through the trees, and once, a heavy thud shook the roof, a branch. Probably. Grace flinched, but Samuel was already up, checking the window. "It's fine," he said calmly. "Nothing we can't handle." Grace exhaled slowly, nodding, but her mind still raced. When Lily finally drifted off to sleep by the fire, Grace joined Samuel at the table. The storm roared outside, but in the small circle of lamplight, the world felt safe. He looked up at her, sensing her unease. "You've been quiet," he said gently. "I'm thinking." She replied, about what she hesitated, about how fast everything can change. "A few months ago, I didn't know if I'd survive the winter. Now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." Samuel smiled slightly. "You made this place what it is. Grace, you brought life back into it." She looked down, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I just cooked and cleaned. You built this." He shook his head. "No, I built a house. You turned it into a home." There was a long silence after that, but it wasn't awkward. The air between them carried something unspoken, something that had been growing for weeks. When the fire burned low, Grace stood to add another log. Samuel rose too, taking the wood from her hands. Their fingers brushed. She froze, feeling the warmth of his skin even through the chill. He held her gaze. Grace. Her breath caught. But before either could speak, the wind outside gave a violent roar, and the lights flickered, then went out. The room plunged into darkness. Lily stirred in her sleep, whimpering softly. Grace moved quickly, lighting another lamp from the embers of the fire. The soft glow returned, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Samuel exhaled, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Guess the storm didn't want us getting too serious. Grace laughed quietly, the tension easing. Maybe it knows we've both had enough of trouble for one lifetime. He leaned against the mantel, watching her in the flickering light. You ever think maybe trouble's just what life throws at the brave ones? She met his eyes. And which one are you, both? He said, brave enough to keep trying, fool enough to think it matters. She smiled, the kind that started small but grew until it softened her whole face. It matters, she said softly. More than you think. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, but the little house held firm. Grace and Samuel stayed by the fire, talking in low voices about small things, the horses, the spring planting, the way Lily had started asking when the flowers would come back. At one point, Grace asked, do you ever think about leaving here? Seeing something new? Samuel shook his head. Not anymore. Everything I want to see is already here. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than she meant them to. Then she looked away, her heart thudding softly. When the storm finally began to quiet, snow still whispered against the windows, but the wind had calmed. Grace stood to check on Lily again, pulling the quilt higher over her daughter's small shoulders. As she turned back, Samuel was watching her. The light from the lamp traced the lines of his face strong, weathered, but gentle. You know, he said quietly, I used to think peace meant being alone, but now I think peace is having someone worth protecting. Grace swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. You've done that, Samuel? For both of us? He shook his head. Not just me. You've been protecting me too from the silence, from the past. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air thick with unspoken words. Then Grace smiled soft, sure, and full of warmth. Maybe that's what home really is, two people protecting each other from the dark. Samuel's gaze softened, and something deep inside him shifted. Then I reckon we finally found ours. Outside, the storm eased into a soft snow. The flakes fell slow and quiet, blanketing the land in peace. Inside, the fire burned steady, the warmth of it mingling with the quiet rhythm of hearts finally learning how to rest. The storm passed some time before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. When Grace opened her eyes, the first light of morning was slipping through the curtains soft and gold, like it had been poured gently across the floorboards. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The house was still, except for the faint creak of wood as it settled against the cold. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted through the air. She smiled to herself. Samuel was always up before sunrise, no matter how fierce the night before had been. She wrapped her shawl tighter and made her way down, her bare feet light on the steps. Samuel was at the stove, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He turned when he heard her. Mornin', Grace. Morning, she said softly, her voice still heavy with sleep. You didn't have to make that. I didn't have to, he said, handing her a cup, but I wanted to. She took it, their fingers brushing for just a moment. The warmth of the cup seeped through her hands, and she found herself looking at him, really looking. His hair was still damp from washing, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the faint trace of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Outside the window, sunlight touched the snow, turning it to silver. It was a breathtaking sight. The valley spread out beneath a soft white sky, the mountains glowing in the distance. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Samuel nodded. "Always is after a storm. The land looks new again, like it's forgiven itself." Grace looked at him, her chest tightening. "You make it sound like people can do that too." He smiled faintly. "Maybe they can." Lily's small voice broke the quiet. Mama Grace turned to see her daughter standing at the foot of the stairs, still in her nightgown, her hair tangled from sleep. She rubbed her eyes and smiled when she saw the snow. "It looks like sugar." Samuel chuckled. "Sugar that'll freeze your nose off if you eat it." Grace laughed softly, setting her cup down. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you dressed. Then maybe we'll all take a walk after breakfast." An hour later, the three of them stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold, but the sun was bright, and the sky stretched endlessly blue. Samuel walked ahead, crunching a path through the snow, while Lily skipped behind, her mittened hands reaching out to catch flakes that still drifted from the trees. Grace followed, her boots sinking slightly with each step. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this kind of quiet happiness, not the fragile, fleeting kind, but the steady kind that warms you from the inside. They reached the fence line, where the snow lay untouched and glistening. Samuel leaned against a post, watching Lily chase a rabbit's trail through the drifts. "She's got your spirit," he said. Grace smiled. "And your stubbornness." He looked at her, his eyes bright beneath the brim of his hat. Stubbornness isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just another word for hope. She met his gaze. "You always talk like that, like the world's teaching you something new every day." He shrugged lightly. "Maybe it is. Maybe we just stop listening after a while." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "You ever wish for anything more?" "Samuel." He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Used to wish for what I lost. Then I stopped wishing altogether. But lately—" He trailed off, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Lately, I find myself wishing again." Her voice was soft, for what he looked at her then. Really looked. For a reason to stay still. Grace felt her heart stutter. "You mean," he nodded slowly, eyes never leaving hers. "I've been running from ghosts for a long time, Grace. But when I'm here, with you and Lily, it feels like the past finally stops chasing me." Her breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The air between them was cold, but her face felt flushed, her hands warm. "Samuel," she said, barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "Just don't run any more." Grace looked out at the wide white valley, the sunlight blazing against the snow. She thought of all the years she'd spent afraid of men like Collins, of hunger, of loneliness, of herself. For the first time, she realized none of it had a hold on her anymore. She turned back to him, her voice trembling. "I'm not running." He smiled, a small, honest, hopeful smile that made her chest ache. Lily came running up, her cheeks red and eyes bright. "Mama, Mr. Reed. Look, I found a bird's nest." Grace crouched to see. It was half buried under the snow, a delicate little cradle of twigs and feathers. She brushed it gently with her mitten. "It's empty now, sweetheart. But when spring comes, Maybe new birds will find it." Lily nodded solemnly, then slipped her tiny hand into Samuel's. "We'll keep it safe till then." Samuel squeezed her hand. "We sure will." They stayed outside until the cold began to bite, then returned to the house, stamping snow from their boots. Grace hung up their coats, still smiling. The fire in the hearth glowed warmly, and the smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air again. As Lily sat by the fire, drawing in her little notebook, Grace turned to Samuel. "You know," she said quietly, "when I first came here, I thought all I wanted was work away to survive. But now—" He looked at her. "Now what?" Her voice trembled, but not from fear. "Now I think I found a life." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the reflection of the firelight in his eyes. "Then don't let it slip away." Grace smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I won't." Outside, the snow kept falling slow and steady, soft as a promise. The world around them shimmered under the pale sun, and inside that small house on the edge of Silver Creek, 3 hearts beat together in the rhythm of something rare and precious. It wasn't just peace. It was the beginning of love. By the time the first signs of spring began to show, Silver Creek had transformed once more. The snow had melted into dark, fertile soil, and the river behind the barn ran full and bright, carrying the sound of renewal through the valley. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, of something clean and alive. Grace stood by the porch one morning, watching the mist rise from the fields. The sunlight broke through it in streaks of gold, touching the tips of the budding trees. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling something she hadn't felt in years' certainty. Behind her, Lily's laughter rang out. The little girl ran across the yard chasing Pepper the cat, her curls bouncing with every step. Grace smiled. That sound, the laughter of her child, had once felt impossible. Now, it was the sound of home. Samuel stepped out of the barn carrying a sack of feed over his shoulder. "You're up early," he said, setting it down beside the fence. "Couldn't sleep," Grace replied. "The light came in through the curtains. I forgot what spring looked like." Samuel wiped his hands on a cloth. "It's a good one this year. Soil's ready for planting early. Might be the best season we've had in a while." Grace looked toward the fields. "You think we'll have enough hands to help?" "We will," he said. "I put the word out in town, and I reckon we've got one more pair of hands right here." He nodded toward her, smiling. Grace chuckled. "I don't know about that. I've got smaller hands to look after." Samuel's gaze softened. "You've been looking after all of us since the day you got here." She looked down, her heart warming in that quiet way he always seemed to cause without trying. After breakfast, the 3 of them set to work, Lily handing small garden tools from the porch, Grace raking soil in the kitchen garden, Samuel fixing the broken rail near the barn. The sound of life filled the air, the scrape of wood, the call of birds, the steady rhythm of renewal. At midday, Grace straightened her back and looked over the field. "You know," she said, shading her eyes, "it's strange. I used to think life stopped after loss, but maybe loss is what makes room for new things to grow." Samuel leaned on his hammer, watching her. "You sure it's the land you're talking about?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe not." He stepped closer, the sunlight catching the faint lines around his eyes. "You've changed since the day you came here, Grace. Not just the way you smile, the way you stand." "And how's that?" she asked softly. "Like someone who belongs," he said. She blinked back sudden tears. "It's been a long time since I felt that." They stood there in silence, the wind carrying the smell of cedar and earth. Lily's laughter broke it again, bright and free. Later that evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned to rose and amber, Grace walked to the creek alone. The water shimmered in the fading light, and the air hummed with the first songs of frogs and crickets. She thought of the woman she'd been frightened, hunted, half alive. That woman was still somewhere inside her, but she was no longer in control. Grace had found something stronger: forgiveness. Not for Collins, not even for the world, but for herself. She sat on a smooth rock by the water, her reflection rippling softly. Samuel's voice came from behind her. "Didn't think I'd find you down here." She turned slightly. "Just needed a minute." He walked closer, hands in his coat pockets. "You look like you're thinking deep." "Maybe," she said, smiling, "about how everything keeps moving, even after everything that's happened. The creek still runs, the trees still bloom." He nodded. "That's how life works. It keeps going. And if we're lucky, it lets us start over." Grace looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think we were meant to find each other?" Samuel hesitated, then sat beside her, his voice low. "I don't know about meant, but I do know I'm grateful we did." For a moment, neither spoke. The sky deepened to violet, and a pair of geese flew overhead, their cries echoing faintly over the water. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, the old wedding ring she had once worn, its gold dulled by time. She turned it in her hand, watching the last of the light catch on it. "I used to wear this because it reminded me who I was," she said softly. "Then I took it off because it reminded me of everything I'd lost. Now," she looked at Samuel, "now I think I can let it go." She stood, walked to the edge of the creek, and tossed it gently into the water. It sank with a small splash, the ripples spreading until they disappeared. When she turned back, Samuel was watching her, not with pity, but with something far deeper. "You sure?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded. "I don't need the past to tell me who I am anymore." He smiled slow, warm, proud. "Then I reckon you're the bravest person I've ever known." She stepped closer, her eyes shining. "No, Samuel, I'm just someone who finally stopped running." And then, for the first time, she reached for his hand. He took it, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. They stood like that in the cool spring dusk, two souls who had walked through fire and found peace on the other side. When they returned to the house, Lily was waiting by the door, her arms full of wildflowers she had picked from the edge of the yard. "Mama, Mr. Reed." "Look what I found." Grace knelt, smiling. "They're beautiful, sweetheart." Lily handed one to Samuel. "For you. You helped the flowers grow." He took it, his eyes softening. "I think your mama had a hand in that, too." Grace glanced at him, and their eyes met not in surprise this time, but in quiet knowing. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Grace stepped out onto the porch. The stars stretched endless across the Montana sky. Behind her, the door creaked, and Samuel joined her, leaning against the railing. He handed her a small box, simple, wooden, hand-carved. "Found this in town last week," he said. "Thought you might like it." She opened it. Inside was a silver chain, with a tiny charm shaped like a feather. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What does it mean?" He smiled faintly. "Freedom." Grace looked at him, her heart full. "You always know exactly what to say." He shrugged, his tone gentle. "Maybe it's just easier when you're talking to the right person." For a long time, they stood side by side in the quiet. the sound of the creek whispering through the night. Grace turned to him, her voice soft. "Samuel, yeah, I think I'm ready." For what? She smiled. For whatever comes next. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of every dawn yet to come, the promise of seasons, of love, of life rebuilt not from fear, but from hope. And in that quiet moment, beneath the endless stars of Silver Creek, they both knew they had finally found what they'd been searching for all along. Not just survival, but belonging. Not just peace, but love, at its heart. Her voice shook as she asked for work. The cowboy said, "I don't need a servant. I need a wife," is not just a romance. It's a story about healing, forgiveness, and the power of quiet love. Grace and Samuel teach us that true strength isn't loud. It's patient. It's the courage to trust again after life has broken you. Sometimes, the greatest rescue doesn't come from heroes or miracles. It comes from an ordinary person who chooses to stay when everyone else walks away. This story reminds us that love is not about fixing someone, but about walking beside them while they find their way back to themselves. That forgiveness of others, of the past, and of ourselves is the beginning of peace. We all carry burdens, regrets, and scars that no one else can see. But even the deepest wounds can heal when they are met with understanding, kindness, and time. So wherever you are, whatever you've survived, let this story remind you that hope is never truly gone. There is always a way back to light, even after the darkest night. Thank you for spending your time and heart with this story. If it touched you, if you saw a piece of yourself in Grace's strength or Samuel's quiet faith, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep telling stories that remind us all, no matter how far we fall, love real, gentle love, can still bring us home.